Namaste, everyone, and welcome back to our next episode on the podcast as part of the EkaShri Schools of Yoga. So, as we've been doing in the past, we've been aiming to have these different 30 to 45-minute little episodes where we discuss the key concepts within yoga philosophy. And as we've mentioned before in the past couple of episodes, right, the goal of this podcast isn't to just give sort of textbook lectures and definitional aspects on different concepts and ideas within yoga philosophy, but rather to explore the topic in an accessible way and really focus on the real world applications and how we can think about applying these different concepts into our day-to-day lives. So as we've said in the past, if you do have any subjects or topics that you would like to suggest, definitely feel free to email us at info@ekashri.yoga and let us know. So with that, why don't we go ahead and start with our topic for today. So Shriramji, as we've been doing in the past and as the audience hopefully is aware, we will continue our discussion of Ashtanga Yoga today. And now we will be focusing on the next limb or the sixth limb of Ashtanga Yoga, which is going to be Dharana, after discussing the yamas, niyamas, asanas, pranayama, and pratyahara in the last few weeks. So at its core, Shriramji, what does the word Dharana mean to you?
Namaste Vedantji, and namaste everyone. So yes, now we are transitioning into what Patanjali calls the Antaranga Sadhana, which means inner practices. So before we jump into Dharana, which is the sixth limb of Ashtanga Yoga, whatever we have discussed so far, the first 5 limbs, namely Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, and Pratyahara, which you have covered so far, they're all clubbed under Bahiranga Sadhana, which means external practices, by which we mean we can observe somebody else doing these practices. For example, when somebody is doing a posture, yoga asana, it's self-evident. Perhaps they're doing the asanas on a yoga mat, so you can clearly see them doing the practice. Same thing with pranayama. And even the yamas and niyamas, you can perceive when somebody is, for example, practicing non-violence, ahimsa. It is obvious. Whereas the last 3 limbs, it is not externally evident. It is only evident to the practitioner, the subject of the practice. So dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, the last 3 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga, are therefore called inner practices or antaranga sadhana, inner practices. Patanjali says, Trayam antarangam purvebhyaha. That means these 3 are inner practices compared to the first 5. Now, perhaps to make this very clear distinction, in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali gives a chapter break. The 5th limb, the practice of dharana, it appears in the beginning of the 3rd chapter. So after the first 5 of the Ashtanga Yoga, the 6th limb starts in the fresh chapter, chapter 3. So that being said, what is dharana? So the literal meaning of the word dharana is to grasp or to hold. And the way in which Patanjali defines dharana is deshabandhas chittasya dharana. That means we are locking. Bandha means lock or to bind. The word bandha is of course familiar to many of the yoga practitioners. Bandha means to bind or lock. To lock or to hold or to grasp the mind in one place using the chitta, and we will explore a little bit more in today's session what exactly is chitta. Usually we loosely translate this word chitta as mind. So when we hold the mind in a limited place, or you put a boundary outside of which the mind is not allowed to wander, so this practice is called dharana. So you grasp hold of an object. Just like we use our hand to grasp an object, we use our mind to grasp an object, and thereby we limit the scope of the mind to establish itself in one spot or in a limited place. You establish a boundary, and one of the examples that my teacher used to give is, suppose you have cattle, say a cow that is grazing in a very large field. So it keeps on eating the grass, whatever is there in that field. and then slowly it makes its way, it explores the whole place. But when you put a fence around it, you are limiting the place beyond which you cannot wander. The cow cannot wander beyond the boundary. And the same thing we can do to our mind. So when we look at the thoughts that we entertain in our mind, in the course of a few seconds or a few minutes, if we notice the trajectory of the thoughts in the mind, it goes all around the place. But when we put a fence around it, when we put a boundary around it and limit the place in which the mind can wander, then that is dharana. So you allow the mind to limit itself or to grasp one object. That is dharana.
Yeah, and thanks for explaining that, Shriramji, so wonderfully with the analogy. That makes a lot of sense. So I think, and obviously we want to dive into this concept a little bit more, but one thing that, I personally am curious about, and I think probably, is a question that a lot of, people listening will probably have as well, is our natural state, right, of being is, I would assume, one where sort of the thoughts keep coming in and out and sort of the mind is a little bit, wandering, distracted, etc. Or is it supposed to be the opposite, where the mind is sort of calm and composed and it's sort of a state of disequilibrium if you are having that monkey mind? So which one, I guess, is the natural state of being?
Yes, in fact, the mind has these two ends or these two polarities. It can either be distracted or it can be consolidated so that it is established in one point. So these two possibilities exist in the mind. And later on in the Yoga Sutras, when Patanjali talks about the mechanics of the mind, he talks about these two tendencies. The mind has a tendency either to scatter itself and wander all around the place. So the mind is in different pieces. That is one possibility. Another possibility is that the whole mind is now together. There is a unity in the mind and it is consolidated at one point. It is in a place of dharana. So both these possibilities exist. And during the course of our life, perhaps we may have encouraged one of these tendencies more than the other. Maybe we have established the tendency of the scattered mind. We have allowed that more than a focused mind. So naturally, the strength of that tendency, the strength of that habit, where the mind is distracted or when the mind is scattered, is more prevalent than bringing the mind to a place of focus or to a place of one-pointedness. But it can be reversed, or we can strengthen the habit of the mind to be one-pointed. It is possible. And that is one of the objectives of the practice of dharana, how we can strengthen the ability for the mind to focus. It is possible. So to answer your question, yes, both possibilities exist.
Got it. And I think that polarity, that's a very interesting concept, right? Where we sort of distinguish between, one maybe isn't necessarily sort of the steady state, but rather it can deviate between the two, right? Depending on which sort of set of circumstances you find yourself and what kind of context you find yourself in. So that is an interesting concept. And so I think that, that brings us to the next point, which is, what basically is the importance of having this concentration, putting the boundary around and the fence around sort of a wandering mind, if you will. And I guess what is the role, beyond the more obvious and very standard reasons, what is the role and benefits of dharana in, any daily life?
So first of all, when the mind is scattered, or when the mind is in different pieces, then we can imagine it is like a little tug of war that is going on. So the mind is getting pulled in different directions and it doesn't feel very good. So there is a feeling of being torn apart and it is not a very comfortable experience. So when we consolidate the mind, we bring a cohesive unity and it feels good. My teacher used to say, when the mind is in pieces, there is no peace of mind. So when we bring the mind together, there is a harmony in it. In fact, one of the meanings of the word yoga is to unite in harmony. And we bring that union in the mind rather than allowing the mind to get scattered in so many different places. Bring the mind together, bring a cohesive unity, integrate the mind. So that is the value of dharana. But there is more to it. When we consolidate the mind, we also bring strength. There is more power in that. And we can think of an analogy where when we take a magnifying glass, we can focus the rays of the sun to one point and it becomes more powerful. So using a magnifying glass, when you bring the rays of the sun together in one point, then you create a lot of power there. There is a lot of energy in a very small place. Or you can think of another analogy where you have a flowing water and you have a small bottleneck, like a funnel. And when the water gushes through the small bottleneck, there is more speed in the water. There is not more powerful flow in the water. And the same thing happens in the practice of dharana. So when you limit the boundary on the wandering mind, so what happens is we bring more power. There is more concentration, there is more focus, and there is more energy into it. For example, when we take a New Year's resolution, and when there is power behind that thought, okay, I resolve to practice yoga every day. Suppose we take that New Year's resolution. The strength of that thought will determine how successful we are in keeping up that resolution. So we can strengthen our thoughts by bringing focus to it, by bringing the all parts of the mind to entertain the same thought rather than having a scattered mind. So just like this magnifying glass example or this water flowing through a funnel example, we can strengthen our thought. We can boost more energy into our thoughts by bringing the mind to a place of focus. So that is one of the benefits of dharana.
And that makes a lot of sense. And I especially, I think appreciate the analogy of that whole magnifying glass concept where you have that, like you said, you're consolidating the mind, putting the pieces together, and then that singular attention and focus allows you to more precisely, I guess, identify and think clearly and just achieve what you're trying to do, right, with that particular thought or that particular thing going through your head. So are there any particular, thing, for lack of a better way to put it, things or elements or entities that dharana works best for? So, and I think what I mean by that is, right, when we're trying to use that magnifying glass, for example, to crystallize or think more clearly, is there anything specifically that is sort of concrete we can discuss that dharana applies most to, or what exactly should we be thinking about the purpose of dharana when it comes to sort of using that magnifying glass for?
In fact, most of the activities that we do that are important to us will benefit with the practice of dharana. So whatever it is, perhaps we are writing our homework, for example, to give a very practical example, or suppose we are at our workplace and perhaps the task at hand requires all our attention. So we consolidate the mind so that the mind does not get scattered and there is more power we bring in, more determination that we bring in to do that task, to complete that task. So most of the activities will benefit through the practice of dharana. And later on, perhaps in the next week's session, we will see there are some activities where we need a defocused mind, where we need the opposite. For example, if you want a creative thought, like for example, a poet, when they wait for new ideas to strike their mind, perhaps they benefit by defocusing the mind, the opposite of dharana, but we will look into that in the next week's session. But there are so many activities. In fact, most of the things that we do in daily life, it will benefit with the practice of dharana.
Got it. And that's interesting that there's, sort of a defocusing, which is also equally important, which we'll probably explore next week. And I think I know what you're hinting at, but that'll be interesting to kind of see the dichotomy between the two and understand, where which one works best and why, and sort of what are the puts and takes of each one. So I guess that's something that, we can definitely look forward to next time. So that maybe let's, bring it a little bit more concrete if possible, Shriramji. I think that's something that, myself and the audience will probably benefit from. So we've discussed so far that the concept of dharana really is to bring that unique sort of singular focus to what you're doing, or basically put that fence around the concept of the wandering mind, and sort of boxing your thoughts to make sure that you're really focused on the one thing that you want to be focused on in that particular thought. So how do you basically think about practicing dharana? And I think the first thing that might be helpful to start with is that in just reading a little bit about the concept and about how people tend to think about it, it seems like there is a sort of internal and external way of practicing dharana, whereby you focus on something either internally or externally. So can we start maybe with that, and just if you can maybe give an sort of explanation around this internal versus external sort of use of tools to focus the mind through the practice of dharana. How exactly does that work? And is there one we should think about adopting over the other? And, for example, does internal focus equate to a better state of being versus external focus? Or how should we, just think about that more broadly?
In fact, in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali gives a lot of examples where we can place our focus, where we can place the chitta. And so, stepping back a little bit, the practice that Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras recommends as a prerequisite for the mind to focus, or for the mind to consolidate itself in dharana, the prerequisite is the practice of pranayama, which is what we saw in one of the earlier sessions, where pranayama deals mainly with breath work. We use the breath to channelize the flow of prana in the system. So one of the benefits of pranayama that Patanjali suggests is dharana sucha yogyata manasaha. He gives that sutra. So the practice of pranayama, breath work, it helps to consolidate the mind in one place, in dharana. So that's a prerequisite. So it increases the mental capacity of focus. So whenever the mind is scattered, it is unable to focus in one place, we can benefit by doing pranayama there. And for those of us who practice pranayama on a regular basis, perhaps every day, you will discover this yourself. At the end of the practice of pranayama, you will notice the mind is more settled down. The mind is in a single point. It is not jumping around or wandering all over the place. So the mind is established, consolidated in one place. So dharana happens naturally with the practice of pranayama. So regarding
and Shriramji, just on that really quickly, are there any specific practices within pranayama that are helpful for getting into the preparatory state for dharana, or is sort of a more holistic pranayama practice okay?
So Patanjali, he doesn't give specific examples. So one could say it's the latter. So the general all-around practice of pranayama, it helps the mind to consolidate.
Got it.
If the mind is in pieces, in other words, the mind is scattered, it's all over the place, then after a session of pranayama, you will notice the mind is more one-pointed now, and it is more easily able to focus. In fact, in our yoga school, where where I studied with my teacher for 14 years, so whenever we begin any theory session of yoga, for example, the study of the Yoga Sutras or study of the Bhagavad Gita or any yoga text, we always used to begin with a few minutes of pranayama, because perhaps the mind was in a different context. Mind was engaged with some other task or activity. And when we want to bring the mind to the present moment, so that it's not thinking about the past or worrying about the future, we want the mind now, here, in one place, then the practice of pranayama helps. So going back to the question of external or internal objects, so one of the things that we discover is it is easier to grasp an object that we like or that we love. You see, whenever we like something, then we don't resist that object when we hold with our mind, you see. So For example, my teacher used to say that many of the parents come to him and they used to ask him, "Oh, my son or my daughter is not focusing on their studies in their academics. So, will you please teach them some exercises so that the focus can happen on their studies?" What he used to say was, it was very interesting. When children, when they focus on a video game, playing a video game, then it comes naturally because they love it. So we need to create a context where we love the object that the mind is trying to grasp. And when there is affinity, or when there's a liking, or when there's a devotion to that subject, then automatically the dharana happens. So to pick an object where we can hold the mind in focus, there are some suggestions or recommendations that are given. And one of them is to pick an object that is sacred, that uplifts you, and pick an object that you like, so that you don't have to resist it with the mind, like that. And it can be anything, a symbol or any object. There's a classic practice in dharana called trataka, where we simply use the flame of a candle as the object to focus upon. So that is an example of holding our awareness to that specific object. So like that, we can pick any object that is sacred, or that uplifts you, that inspires you. Perhaps we can even think of somebody like a role model who inspires you. So these are different uh, places, or desha, as Patanjali says in the Yoga Sutras, different places in which we can pour our awareness to hold it in one place. And there are other areas, for example, internal place of focus. There could be different energy centers in the body, what is called the chakras in the system. For example, the heart chakra, or the third eye chakra, and so forth. And the subject of chakras, of course, it's a very vast subject that perhaps we will cover in one of the future sessions. But those are some areas in which we can hold the focus of the mind. So it can be either external or internal.
I see. And so I think what's interesting about that is that this isn't necessarily sort of a static, object per se, right? So for example, you mentioned the practice of Trataka, which for our listeners is the practice, right, where you will basically focus on a flame, like you mentioned, right, and use that as sort of a sole focusing point to essentially silence out the different thoughts in the mind. And sometimes you might even move your finger as well to just keep the focus and concentration on that particular object as well, right? So that's interesting, because I think that's sort of an example of a very I don't want to use the word static entity, but it's sort of one thing. Whereas when you made when you put the example of, for example, someone playing a video game, right, and that devotion and sort of that intense focus that you see when they're playing, which is more of a sort of a dynamic process, if you will, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that is just one object that you necessarily associate with that particular sense of focus, but it could be a process or an activity that also helps you to do that, which is why I think it makes a lot of sense just connecting the dots between, for example, the preparatory practice with pranayama, that focus on the breath, that focus on making sure you're, whether it's slowing down the breath, whether it's relaxing the body, whatever that aim is, you kind of have that aim as you go through the practice. And so that level of sort of devotion and that level of focus, I think you can definitely understand why it is sort of a preparatory practice for the actual practice of dharana. Although to a certain extent they do overlap, and they are sort of, integrated at a very fundamental level. So I think that's incredibly interesting. So thanks for sharing that analogy there. And so, based on that, I think, Shriramji, why don't we talk about really quickly how the Limbs of yoga, I think we have touched upon this actually just in the last couple of minutes here, and also just more broadly, really you can kind of understand the flow of how this focus kind of ties in, right, with all the different limbs of yoga that we've studied previously, whether it's even the yamas and niyamas, right, that focus, for example, on things like telling the truth, on things like cleanliness, that you just kind of need to have attention to and awareness of. You see it there in the actual physical postures, the asanas, right? You have that when you're holding a final position, for example, you have that focus, that pointing and looking at one point in front of you to maintain your balance. You have it there. Pranayama, we just likewise discussed. But would you have any other sort of insights, maybe a level deeper, on how exactly dharana fits in with all the different limbs of yoga that we've studied so far? And I know it does tie in a lot more with the more internal focused limbs that we'll study in the next couple of sessions. But what would you maybe say to how everything starts to tie together, just so that our audience has a understanding of how all these different concepts really come together, like we discussed in the beginning of starting with the Ashtanga Yoga philosophy, and how they aren't necessarily limbs and preparatory practices for one another, but rather they come together cohesively to together produce an effect, as opposed to one step leading to another.
Yes, in fact, the example that you mentioned of asanas, especially balancing postures, they are an excellent way to strengthen dharana. In other words, many of the balancing postures, for example, the vrikshasana, the tree posture, where we balance the whole body in a standing posture by balancing on one leg. Now, whenever we attempt a balancing posture, we quickly discover that we need all the mental focus. We need to focus perhaps on a point straight ahead, fix our gaze on that point. Whenever the mind is distracted, then the body starts wobbling. The body is not steady. The sthiram is not there. So in order to balance in a steady manner, in order for the body to balance steadily, it requires or it demands mental focus. So we can think of balancing postures are more for the mind than for the body. We can think of the balancing postures are they are actually practices of dharana much more than asanas. Of course, they are postures. They perhaps are clubbed under the category of asanas, but they are more of an exercise for the mind than for the body. So that is one way in which we bring strength to the dharana practice. And in fact, in any of the practice where we bring the body and the mind to the edge of the comfort zone, then it requires our mental focus. Anything new that we do that is not already in our habit or not already in our comfort zone, for that it requires all our mental focus. To give an example, the first time when we start riding a bicycle, when we are learning how to do that activity, we cannot be distracted. All our mental focus should be there with that activity. And perhaps once we get skillful at it, after that, perhaps it doesn't require our mental focus. But the point is, whenever we take ourselves to the edge of the comfort zone, then automatically the mind brings, the mind consolidates itself into the practice of dharana. So the mind cannot be scattered in that moment when we are at the edge of the comfort zone. So we have seen two practices so far for dharana. One is the practice of balancing postures in asanas. The second one we saw is trataka. And there are other practices as well. For example, one of the classic practices is japa. Japa is repeated chanting of a mantra, a sound or a syllable, or it can be an idea as well, where you constantly repeat, perhaps in the mind or even chant out aloud. So the point is, when we think of an idea or when there's a thought that happens in the mind, when we don't remind ourselves of the thought again, perhaps the mind will drift away. You see? So we put a boundary to the wandering mind by bringing the mind back to that same thought. and again back to the same thought or back to the same mantra and bring the mantra again in the mind. So again and again, repeating that same thought or repeating that same mantra in the mind is also a practice of dharana. And this is called japa, the practice of japa. So, in fact, in the Bhagavad Gita, it is said that japa is the highest practice of yajna, where yajna is a purifying activity. So, this practice is highly emphasized or highly recommended in the yoga text, the practice of japa, and it will bring the mind towards that same single thought again and again. So, we are not allowing the mind to stray away from that thought. So, this is also an excellent practice of dharana.
And so, Shriramji, on that note, should we? I really like how you pointed out that at the beginning, right, when you put yourself in that sort of uncomfortable situation, or maybe a novel situation, if not uncomfortable, right, just naturally, because the mind is not able to go on autopilot by itself because it hasn't seen that situation before, or it's sort of a high stakes situation, that natural flow into dharana, or that concept of being naturally focused just because you don't have really another choice, right? That comes automatically. So when we start to hit that, maybe, we've done this thing a couple of times, it's starting to feel a lot more sort of easy to do. We can start to think about multitasking, get more complacent, and multitask while we're doing this particular task. How should we think about maybe bridging that so that we maintain our levels of focus on that particular task? Is it through, so the concept of japa makes sense, right? If it's prayer or intense focus on something, I think there are certain situations where that works sort of standalone. But if it's even something you're doing, let's just say at work, you're doing something that's a process you've done over and over, how should we think about sort of retaining focus in that situation?
So you're right. When we do the same task again and again, it may be at the edge of the comfort zone in the beginning, but with continued practice, or when we do it every day, then it becomes a habit, and it becomes our second nature. In fact, it becomes well within our comfort zone. So that's where we need, when we expand the boundary of the comfort zone, we need to step up higher. In other words, we need to approach the new boundary of the comfort zone so that uh, the process of growth happens. Otherwise, we will be trapped inside the comfort zone and there's no growth there. So in dharana, so when we take care to come to the edge of the comfort zone every day, that means the process of growth happens. We are never stagnant. There's always growth that is happening.
Wonderful. That makes a lot of sense. And so then I think the last thing wanted to touch upon here was more of, the real world applications and how should we think about sort of incorporating dharana into the daily life. I think we've touched upon this concept in various different ways, and just the concept is, I think, so dynamic to the point where there's so many different ways within our daily life, within our specific intentional yoga practice, and also beyond that, right, where we will be applying the concept of dharana into whatever we're doing. And I think that's interesting that overall with the discussion, hopefully our audience will take away the fact that there is one part of sort of this intentional focus and this intentional practice of the concept of dharana, but then you also have a lot of sort of involuntary application of dharana, right? So for example, if you're doing something new, like we discussed, or something is, putting you at the edge of your comfort zone, then naturally you're going to be a lot more focused and very intentional with regards to your thoughts. So I think that's incredibly interesting, and hopefully something that our listeners will be able to take away. But if, and again, we touched upon, some of the other practices like pranayama as a preparatory practice for the concept of dharana, and, how to think about specific practices within pranayama, like Trataka, for example, which is not really pranayama, but it's more of a focus to help us get into that state of intense focus. But are there any other sort of, maybe if you had to give a few points of advice when it comes to building dharana into both a defined yoga practice as well as more beyond that into broader life, do you have any advice or tips that you would share with our audience, just on how to really understand and make that concept more concrete for themselves?
Yes. So we have seen three practices so far. One is balancing postures, where it demands our mental focus. The second is the preparation through pranayama. In fact, we can use the breath as a point of focus. So that becomes a dharana. As we do pranayama, we're also doing dharana and we are integrating the two practices. And as we saw before, when we bring more limbs of the Ashtanga Yoga together, synergy happens. So the practice of pranayama as well as dharana, they both strengthen themselves. And the third practice that we saw is the Trataka and also Japa. So we can think of Trataka and Japa as perhaps exclusively dharana. And so let me go back to the definition that Patanjali gives on dharana. So first of all the 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga, Patanjali gives the least amount of sutras for dharana. Perhaps to say, we don't need to scatter our mind on too many sutras here, just focused, just one sutra he gives, maybe one pointed focus, right? So, Desha Bandhas Chittasya Dharana is the definition that he gives. And he doesn't talk about dharana elsewhere, apart from when he mentions in pranayama that it's a preparation. So when we look at Desha Bandhas Chittasya Dharana, that means we are limiting the chitta, the mind, in one place. Desha literally means place. Now, the word chitta is very interesting. And so that the understanding of the word chitta will help us in our practice of dharana. So what is chitta? So we can think of chitta as the screen of the mind in which all the sensations from the outer world, what we see, what we hear, taste, smell, or touch, so all the sensations from the external world, they get projected onto the screen and we're actually watching this screen. For example, whatever object that we perceive from outside, say we are observing a tree, we are not seeing the tree directly. We are actually sensing the tree through the picture that is created in the screen of the chitta. Because the light from the tree, it hits the retina. That's a little image of the tree that is created in the back of the eye. And that is sensed through the optic nerves. And finally, the image of that is presented in the screen of the mind, which is called the chitta. So there is a tree in the chitta, and that's how we perceive the tree. Now, whatever enters the system through the senses is not what is ultimately observed by the seer within, the Purusha within, because many of the things that are presented to us, we may ignore it, right? For example, when we go to a party, say we are having a conversation with somebody in the party, we hear sounds from so many places, but our mind is focused on this single conversation. We hear the sounds of others speaking, we hear the words, what others are saying, but we are not focused on it. We are not following the thought that is expressed by somebody else. Whereas we are just having this conversation with the one that we are speaking to, you see. So ultimately, whatever is in the chitta is whatever is highlighted. It is not whatever is present in the whole space that the senses provide to the system, but our chitta is restricted to a small portion of it, you see, in that canvas of all the sensations that are received from the 5 senses. We highlight a small portion of it. Maybe with a flashlight, we can think of this analogy. Our chitta is like a flashlight. It is highlighting a small portion of it. So that is the chitta. That is the screen that is presented to the seer. Now, the practice of dharana is to bring that space of that chitta into a smaller and smaller boundary. So we are able to focus in, we can think of it as a one-pointed focus. So that is the practice of dharana. And elsewhere in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali gives a very similar practice. Perhaps we can classify this as dharana. Eka tattva abhyasa. Tat pradishedartham eka tattva abhyasaha. Eka tattva abhyasa means the practice of seeing one thing. rather than allowing the mind to scatter and wander in different places. Make this your practice of bringing the mind to one pointed focus. Eka Tattva Abhyasa. Abhyasa literally means practice. So Eka Tattva. So the practice of seeing one thing rather than multitasking and disintegrating the mind. So bring the mind to a place of one pointed focus. So that is a practice that can be engaged in. So the chitta uh, is it's like a flashlight, that is where we shine the spotlight on one small point, and therefore the thought becomes very powerful.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Shriramji. That was a very, I think, fruitful explanation and very colorful explanation, especially with the analogies on how to understand and think about the concept of dharana more broadly within both, I think, what we're doing as well as more unconsciously as well, to be able to keep that understanding too. So I think, with that, why don't we go ahead and close the session for today. To our audience, hopefully, you've been able to take away a little bit more on the concept of dharana and how exactly, well, first of all, what exactly it is, and more than that, how to actually think about the concept of dharana and apply it to your daily insight there. And I think Shriramji has done a wonderful job of really providing some guidance on how to think about the concept as well going forward. So with that, why don't we go ahead and close out the podcast for today? So we'll be talking about, like Shriramji mentioned, the next couple of limbs within the Ashtanga Yoga philosophy in the next couple of weekends coming up as well. And these also will have to do with a lot more of internal practice and a lot of internal focus, as opposed to sort of the more external facing limbs that we've discussed in the last few weeks. So hopefully now you're starting to see the progression between both the external to the internal, as well as really understanding how these concepts sort of tie in with one another, and they aren't sort of isolated concepts that you kind of progress into one by another, but rather they're different components that put together allows you to kind of equal and build up the whole. So hopefully that is becoming a lot more clear with the concepts that we've been discussing so far. But with that, why don't we go ahead and maybe close out for today, and we look forward to seeing you all next week again. So thank you, Shriramji, once again for the wonderful session today. And we will look forward to seeing everyone again next weekend for the next episode of the podcast.
Thank you.
Namaste.